Thank you all for being here today. We all really appreciate it. We're here today to announce a lawsuit that the state of Washington is filing against the three largest opioid distributors in Washington state. Those three entities are McKesson Corporation, Cardinal Health, and AmerisourceBergen Drug Corporation. These are Fortune 15 companies based on their 2017 revenues. Distributors work directly with pharmacies to supply them with pills. Opioid distributors are legally required to perform two critical functions, and you're going to hear this multiple times. Opioid distributors are legally required to perform two critical functions to prevent the flood of opioids into our state. Number one, they must stop shipment of suspicious orders. And number two, they must notify law enforcement when they do so. For years, these companies illegally shipped suspicious orders into our state. For years, they ignored their legal obligation to alert law enforcement of enormous, suspicious opioid orders. Their conduct, put quite simply, fueled the state's opioid epidemic by shipping staggering amounts of opioids into our state. Today I'm joined by a large number of folks. I'll introduce just a handful, including our speakers, but appreciate everybody who's here, including the extensive legal team and members of the public who are here. My legal team includes a few folks I'll introduce who've been working very hard on this case. Our Complex Litigation Division Chief, Jeff Rupert, also Senior Counsel Peter Helmberger, Assistant Attorney General Martha Rodriguez-Lopez, Assistant Attorney General Andrew Hughes, and Assistant Attorney General Tad Robinson O'Neill. These folks have put in long hours in addition to many other folks on the team on this case, as well as our earlier litigation against Purdue Pharmaceutical. Today you'll hear from Quinault Nation President Vaughn Sharp. The Quinaults have also joined a lawsuit against opioid distributors and have played a key role in trying to bring accountability to what is frankly outrageous conduct. You'll also hear from University of Washington researcher and L9 Medical Director Dr. Gary Franklin, who has published more than 15 peer-reviewed papers on the opioid issue, including reporting some of the first deaths. You'll also hear from two mothers who are very personally impacted by the opioid epidemic, Tammy Waranka from Kirkland, and Shani Jenkins from Olympia. Also joining us today is Rose Dennis. Some of you may recall Rose from a press conference we had some time ago now when we filed our lawsuit against Purdue Pharmaceutical. Rose and her family have been very impacted by the opioid epidemic, and we appreciate Rose being here again in support of this action as well. Just as a background before I get into the details of the litigation, some of the information that we have has been legally designated as confidential. So there are some limits to certain information that we have with this litigation, and we just have to be mindful of that. That is sometimes the case in lawsuits of this nature, but we're going to share the information that we are able to share, which is significant. Our team has reviewed thousands of pages of evidence and shipment data. We've seen the data, and it is shocking. The opioid epidemic has devastated Washington state families and wreaked havoc on our health system, all because these pills were flooded into the state in astonishing numbers. So let me be clear, these three companies had a legal obligation to be a key line of defense against the free flow of opioids into our state. Instead, they were driven by greed. If you ever wonder how an opioid distributor becomes a Fortune 15 company, you ship 2 billion opioids to one state alone, and you ship those pills no matter what. You turn a blind eye to your legal obligations and the human tragedy that results. They had a legal duty to report suspicious orders to the DEA. They were legally obligated not only to report them, but to stop those shipments as well. They did neither. How many pill mills might have been shut down if these distributors had simply followed their legal obligations? How many lives could that have saved? Today I'll outline how the actions of these three distributors fueled the state's opioid epidemic by ignoring these legal obligations to act as a safeguard. We'll also talk about what we hope to achieve from this litigation. We'll have other speakers as well, and then we'll take your questions. So these three companies supply the majority of opioids coming into Washington state. Between 2006 and 2014, during that time period alone, they supplied more than 2 billion opioid pills to Washington. As I mentioned, opioid distributors are legally required to monitor opioid orders they receive, looking for specific factors that can identify suspicious shipments that could be diverted into the illegal drug market. So, for example, if a pharmacy suddenly triples its order quantity, that's a red flag. Or if a pharmacy that typically orders once a month suddenly places an order once a week, that's a red flag. If they determine that the order is suspicious, distributors are legally required to stop the shipment and report the suspicious order to the Federal Drug Enforcement Agency. And I believe we have a chart that once we wrap up, you'll be able to see behind our many folks who are here that outlines those obligations. These companies fail to fulfill that obligation. In fact, even when their internal monitoring flags suspicious orders, the companies often ship them anyway without notifying the DEA. The DEA tracks every shipment of opioids. Much of that data is part of the confidential information that I mentioned earlier, but I can give you a general sense of the scale that we're talking about. So let me give you a couple of examples. In 2014, these three companies shipped enough opioids to Pend Oreille County to supply every single man, woman, and child in that county alone with dozens of pills. In 2009, McKesson alone supplied enough opioids to Pend Oreille County to supply every man, woman, and child with dozens of pills. These companies will say they had compliance programs, but if they did, they were compliance programs in name only. Using a very conservative calculation developed in a court case in the Washington, D.C. Circuit to identify suspicious orders, these companies shipped more than 250,000 suspicious orders to Washington between 2006 and 2014. Using a less conservative calculation developed in one of the other court cases against opioid distributors, these three companies may have shipped more than 3.5 times that many suspicious orders into Washington state, totaling nearly 1 million suspicious orders that should never have been shipped. To put this in context, a typical order contains hundreds of pills. These three companies have been sanctioned repeatedly for not monitoring and reporting suspicious orders. For example, McKesson has paid more than $160 million in fines since 2008, including a record-setting $150 million fine in 2017. The DEA determined the company filled, quote, hundreds of suspicious orders placed by pharmacies participating in illicit internet schemes, but failed to report the orders to the DEA. Cardinal Health has been fined 5 times for a total of nearly $100 million since 2008, including a $34 million fine for what the DEA called, quote, failing to report blatantly suspicious orders. The DEA suspended AmerisourceBergen's license in 2007 over not controlling shipments of prescription opioids to internet pharmacies. The DEA noted that between June 2008 and May 2013, one McKesson distribution facility, quote, processed more than 1.6 million orders for controlled substances, but reported just 16 as suspicious. These distributors had a legal obligation to stop suspicious orders and report them. Because they did not, more opioids flowed into Washington state. That led to, inevitably, more opioid prescriptions filled, more of these dangerous pills find their way into the illegal drug trade, more addiction, and more devastation. I do not have to tell you how crushing the opioid epidemic has been to Washington state and to our country. All you have to do is look at the statistics. Between 2006 and 2017, opioid overdoses killed more than 8,000 Washingtonians. On average, 2 Washingtonians die every day due to an opioid overdose. That's more Washingtons than were killed by car accidents or gun violence by firearms. The sheer volume of pills flooding the market is a key contributor to that devastation. In 2015, there were 8 counties with more prescriptions than people. So I want to be clear, that's prescriptions, not pills. There were more prescriptions than people. Clallam, Grays Harbor, Columbia, Garfield, Asoden, Pend Oreille, Lewis, and Benton. We have a chart you'll be able to see after we're done that outlines those counties. In 2008, there were 16 counties with more prescriptions than people. It is time to hold these companies accountable for the harm that they have caused. What we'll be seeking is the following. We allege that these 3 companies committed multiple violations of the Washington State Consumer Protection Act. As you know, the State Consumer Protection Act outlaws unfair business practices, and that'll be part of our litigation. We also allege that these companies helped create what's called a public nuisance, that's a legal term, public nuisance of the opioid epidemic through their negligent action. What does a public nuisance mean? In this case, the conduct of these companies has fueled a public health crisis, forcing the state and communities across the state to spend massive resources to try to address this crisis. In addition to civil penalties and damages, we're asking the court to order these three companies to give up the profits they made in Washington as a result of their illegal conduct. Sales of opioids are worth billions of dollars every year nationwide, and Washington's portion is expected to be in the many millions. The surrendered profits will be used to remediate the effects of the opioid epidemic, possibly funding treatment, education, and more. That's the goal. So at this point, I'd like to turn to our speakers. First up is Quinault Nation President Vaughn Sharp, who's been a key ally on many, many fronts, and this one is no exception. So President Sharp, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. On behalf of the Quinault Indian Nation, first of all, I want to thank the Attorney General for his bold and aggressive action with filing this lawsuit. I also want to thank the colleagues and the team that stand here with us, the families that have suffered. The Quinault Nation, unlike any other tribal nation across this country, is facing a humanitarian crisis. This last December, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights delivered a report to Congress that outlined and detailed the devastating impacts of alcohol and drug addiction to Indian country. One of the alarming statistics in that report was that tribal nations, our citizens, need treatment at a rate that's twice the national average. 18% of our citizenry is in need of alcohol and drug treatment. We suffer the consequences of alcohol and drug addiction higher than any other citizenry across this country. But I want to make it clear, while we suffer at an alarming and astonishing rates, not one citizen in the state of Washington is immune from this crisis. Every single family is deeply impacted by this crisis. Our healthcare system, our economy, and outright loss of life and loss of futures and productivity. And so when we come together with the state of Washington, tribal nations, we have a history of conflicts and controversies, but at those times when we come together and we stand on bold, aggressive action, there's no question in my mind that we are going to see results, because this crisis takes everyone. We are all impacted, and it's going to take all of us. Now, every day we deal with the symptoms of a crisis. We try desperately to seek out funding to provide treatment. We desperately attend funeral after funeral after funeral, and there are times we feel helpless. We wonder if there are any solutions. But you know, those things that we deal with are symptoms of a much deeper problem. And that deeper problem is that there are companies, there are criminals that seek to profit at our expense at the lives of young people, middle-aged people, and elderly people of every socioeconomic sector that exists in the state of Washington. But while we feel helpless, we know there's a path forward to seek justice. And that path forward is to hold those who are directly responsible accountable. And so today we stand here honorably, we stand here in full force, and we are not going to give up. We are going to continue to seek the justice and bring those who are directly responsible to justice. So together we are here, and I thank you from the bottom of our hearts, those Quinaults that have existed on these sacred lands when time began, and those future Quinaults that will join us, and those future generations of Washington citizens, because we all deserve to have a very bright future, a prosperous future, and a healthy future. And this lawsuit is going to be but another example of bold and aggressive leadership from our champion of justice, Attorney General Bob Ferguson. I thank you for this opportunity, and we stand here with you 110%. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Sharp. Next, you'll hear from Dr. Gary Franklin. Dr. Franklin.
Thank you, Attorney General Ferguson, and thank you for your leadership. I reported the first deaths in the country. Jamie Mai, my pharmacy manager, and I were tracking things. 1999 was when our state regulations became more permissive, and the increasingly permissive regulations occurred in more than 20 states because of fake lobbying by drug companies and their surrogates. We reported these first deaths in 2005, but all of the increased supply of opioids started in 1999 when these regulations passed. Our regulations, which have since been repealed, said that no doctor shall be sanctioned for any amount of opioid written. You could be handing out bags of opioids to patients, and the medical board really couldn't do anything about it. So after we reported the first deaths, these were injured workers who came into our system with a low backache or a shoulder ache, and they died within a few years from prescription opioids. Not one citizen should be dying from a prescription opioid in our state or anywhere in the country. So we became very collaborative at that point, and with the blessing of the legislature and the successive governors, the agency medical directors group, including the Departments of Health, the Department of Labor and Industries, the Medicaid, Healthcare Authority, all of the agencies started working with the highest level clinicians in the state, pain specialists and other specialists, to create the first best practice treatment guidelines related to opioids in 2007, in 2010, and in 2015. And the impact of all of these best practice efforts has been to lead to almost a 60% reduction in the deaths related specifically to prescription opioids. But we have only dug out of this problem by about 40% because of the continued unbelievable supply. Over 200,000 Americans have died from this worst of man-made epidemics in our country, made by doctors and drug companies and distributing companies. So I want to thank the Attorney General for this effort. We believe that there is a path forward to reverse this epidemic, and I just want to quickly mention the three main things that we're doing to reverse the epidemic. Number one is to reduce the amount of opioids going to people for acute pain, such as teenagers who are having a tooth extracted. 20 pills for a 17-year-old who's having a tooth extraction. That is a recipe for disaster subsequently. The second thing is we need to, as agencies, we need to get best practices out in the community for primary care doctors so we can take better care of patients in pain and in chronic pain. And we're doing that also. And the third thing, and this is probably the most difficult thing, is that we need to address the tens of thousands of our citizens who are already on chronic opioids and who are dependent or addicted to opioids. We need to get them the help they need. So we have to have a prevention effort and a treatment effort to be much more collaborative to reverse this worst of man-made epidemics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Franklin. Now we're going to hear from two individuals who are going to speak from a very personal perspective. I've talked, for example, with statistics, and the statistics have a important place to set some context for the scale of the epidemic, for example, that we're facing now. But our next two speakers are mothers who will speak about their personal experience with this epidemic, and I introduced them earlier. But first up, we'll hear from Tammy Oranka. Tammy, thank you for being here, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you. My name is Tammy Warinka, and I'm really thankful to be here today, and it was really something that I got asked to be here and speak, and so sorry about that. I'm sharing my son's story. His name was Seth. He was 30 years old, and on December 31st of 2017, he died of an accidental overdose. He was on methadone. He I believe he had overdosed on heroin. He had also been on Xanax. And so the combination was lethal. And I ended up finding him on a Sunday morning when I tried calling him to go to church with me and couldn't get a hold of him. And I had his landlord go in and knock at the door and see if he was okay. And I was really worried because I called him that morning and I couldn't get a hold of him. And so she finally said, I give you permission, go ahead and go on in and just see if he's okay. So she went in, and he was already dead at that time. And I think he had probably passed away earlier that morning. And I ended up running up there very quickly and just hysterical, not really believing what I was hearing. And it just kind of went from there. So it's been a really tough year for me. I lost my mom 2 months before that. And so 2 deaths in the family was just almost too much for me to bear at the time. I would like to share Seth's story. He was addicted to opiates also, but his story is probably a little bit different than the heroin story and the legal prescriptions that you get in pills. His was going to a methadone clinic, and his drug of choice was methadone, and that is basically synthetic heroin. And if anybody knows anything about that, I've done a little bit of research on it. It was actually discovered by Hitler during World War II, and ended up giving it to the troops when they ran out of morphine, and they made synthetic heroin and gave it to the troops, and that's how it ended up getting started. I'll go ahead and share you just his story. Seth started doing drugs at 13 years old, doing marijuana with some friends. I didn't even know he and his brother were doing so. I was working full time. I was very naive and had never been around drugs at all. I had grown up on a farm in Idaho, and I never grew up in my town where anybody really did a lot of drugs. I came from a very tiny town. And one day I came home and I smelled a funny smell, which kind of smelled like sagebrush to me. I grew up on a farm with a lot of that, and this is where I also started getting my introduction into drugs. At 16 years old, Seth started getting pills from friends, and his drug of choice was methadone pills. Before long, he was getting so dependent that he needed every day in order to make it through the day. At 17 years old, he talked to his grandfather and talked him into starting at a methadone clinic. Not knowing at the time much of anything about it, but hearing that it could help him, he signed up in 2003 to 2004, and he started going 6 days a week to methadone clinics. After a few years, Seth tried to get off, and he started experiencing withdrawals early every morning until he could go to a clinic to get his dose. After experiencing the pain and mental anguish of withdrawal, he decided to try detoxing, but it was so hard for him to break through and get off. At this time, the changes affected his way of life and his choices with others, family, and living. The drug ran his life at every turn and was the first thing he thought of when he got up in the morning and the last thing he thought of when he went to bed. After that, especially if he could make it to the methadone clinic. He always worried about making it to the methadone clinic early in the morning to dose because he always closed at 10:30. And so if you were on your feet walking, or if you had to take a bus, which in his situation usually he had to take a bus, it didn't always get there at 10:30 or by the time he needed to be there. And so sometimes that would be extremely painful because afterwards they didn't give you your dose after that. It was closed, so you had to wait till the next day and go through a 24-hour period before you could ever go and dose again, which is excruciatingly painful. As Seth started being dramatically affected by methadone, he ended up making some bad choices. He would get kicked out of places he lived and eventually ended up on the street for several years. We tried to help on every way we could, but had to let him live his life, praying and hoping that he could get help. On the streets, he was tempted to do other drugs, from opiates to meth. We tried to help him with detox treatment and usually to no avail. First of all, because detox places weren't long enough to give your body a chance to detox off methadone. By this time, Seth was also taking benzodiazepines for anxiety and panic attacks. That in itself was so addictive, and detox places made you detox off anything you were on, even if it was medical and you needed it for anxiety. By this time, after the last 10 years on methadone and hospitalizations in detox, his body started to break down. With at least 50 hospitalizations over a 30-year period, he realized it was almost easier just staying on methadone and either dosing down very, very slowly over a short period of time or staying on it for lifetime maintenance. His health declined, and he ended up needing all his teeth pulled due to negligence of being on the streets. He even had prescription for pain after his teeth were pulled. He got a prescription for pain after his teeth were pulled, but as we were going to the methadone clinic, he had accidentally left his lockbox on top of the car. Not realizing that he did that, we turned around and went back, and it was stolen during that period of about 20 or 30 minutes. After explaining to the doctor, they would not refill even with the pain he experienced, and no doctor will usually reply or refill something like that for an addict. About 5.5 years ago, Seth's life started turning around when he had a salvation experience, and he gave his life to Jesus Christ. I'd never seen him happier, and it changed him from the inside out and gave him peace of mind and a hope in getting through the trials of life. Anyway, that's all I've written there, but after that time, Seth started doing a little bit better, and he started actually wanting to get off methadone. And so he would go to probably about 5 different clinics over a 13-year period, all the way from Everett all the way down to South Seattle at Evergreen. And when he went there, a lot of times he'd say, I want to get off this stuff because it is ruining my life. I have no life. He ended up having 2 children, ended up having to adopt them out because he was not able to take care of them. He didn't have the health and the energy, and the addiction was so bad that he couldn't do that. So they were adopted out. He ended up losing all his teeth. He lost his health, many, many hospitalizations. And during that period of time, we tried to help him get off methadone many times. But the problem is with methadone clinics, you go in and you tell them you want to detox off methadone. They usually say, well, that's okay, but why don't you go up on the dose? And he'd say, I don't want to go up on the dose. I'm already at where I want to be. I want to get off. That's the whole goal of getting off this stuff. And they would try to encourage him to up the dose all the time. And so they'd make it really hard for him. And so they'd say, okay, we're going to detox you, and we're going to give you 5 milligrams a day and detox you in 21 days. And so in 21 days, when you're on methadone, it lives in your bones, it lives in your tissues, it lives in every part of your body, and it's not something easy that you can get off of. And we took him to Harborview Hospital, and when we got there, the doctor said, you know, Seth, you've been on this for over 5 years, and anytime you've been on methadone for over 5 years, you're what we call a lifer, which means that you're probably not going to get off this stuff. You know, it's almost virtually impossible to get off this stuff. And so he didn't know what to do, and so he was caught in a catch-22 of not knowing what to do. And she said, you can go ahead and try to detox, but more than likely you're going to end up going back to the methadone clinic because it's going to be too painful for you. So he went to many detox centers. He went to many different treatment centers. The problem with the detox centers, and this is where I believe the problem is a lot, not only with the responsibility, also with the addict and their choices. They all make choices, and sometimes they get themselves stuck in a situation where they went too far, life got hard, and actually it wasn't fun doing drugs anymore because actually it got you addicted. It changed your brain chemistry. It changes the way you do things. It changes the way you think. And anyway, so he ended up going to Harborview, and he ended up going to detox. But the problem I'm seeing with the detox is that they will only give you a short period of time to detox, usually 3 to 5 to 7 days. That is all the time you can detox on methadone. Well, methadone lives in your system, so when you get out of detox, what do you do then? Okay, you still have it going on in your body. You're sick, you're vomiting, you're throwing up, you can't sleep at night, you're up a week at a time, you can hardly function, hardly get on the bus to get to that clinic the next day. And so it didn't work for him, and he got kicked out of probably every detox facility he probably ever went in because he got too angry because he kept telling them, you know, you give me the withdrawal meds and everything to help me, but those withdrawal meds are addictive in themselves. And so they would give him those meds, but his tolerance level was way up here. And with all the drugs over the years, a little bit that they could legally give him just didn't cut it to get through the pain. And so he ended up leaving. He would go back to the street, and he would buy it on the street. Before he passed away in 2017, he said, Mom, you know, if I could do anything and tell anybody anything, it would be please, please don't go on methadone. And it's not that methadone can't help you. They usually give that to heroin users so they don't use needles, and they can go to a legal clinic and they can take a little pink vial of juice, pink juice, that they give you 6 days a week. You take home a carry case on Sunday. And it can help you short term. It can help you maybe get off the needles and help you get your life back. A lot of people that are on methadone can work a job, they can function, they can have family, and some people do okay. But there's some people that don't. And so he said, Mom, if anything at all, I would warn people if they're going into a methadone clinic, I want to tell them so bad, please don't go. It will ruin your life. It's so much harder than heroin to get off of. It isn't even funny. And I would tell them, don't do it. It's easier coming off the heroin, going through the withdrawal, doing what you need to do than getting on the methadone, which is going to be 10 times worse than the heroin. And so anyway, he just said he would warn people. And the last thing he said before he passed was, he said, Mom, if I ever get a chance to and I get through this, I would really love to go over after those pharmaceutical companies that distribute this stuff. Because he said, when I signed up for methadone when I was 17 years old, and my dad and I helped get him on it, but we didn't know what it was, and we didn't have any idea what we were getting into. They do not tell you that it is more addictive than heroin. They don't tell you that it will destroy your life, and they won't tell you any of this. And they paid $350 a month back in 2004, 2005 to go to a methadone clinic. Finally, over the years, he got on SSI, He was having a hard time. He got on disability, and he was able to get medical coupons, which helped him be able to pay for the methadone. But it's a very expensive drug. They know what they're doing, and they know it keeps people addicted, and it's a billions of dollar industry a year. And they're not going to tell you that it's dangerous and don't take it. And so that's my take on it, and I hope today, I just thank you for the opportunity to bring awareness. That is my son's story, that is a personal methadone story, and I know it affects a lot of people out there on methadone, and they're in a lot of pain and a lot of hurting. And so thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate that.
Thanks so much, Tammy, for that. And next we're going to hear from Shani Jenkins, who will tell her story, and then we'll take questions. So.
Good morning. My name is Shani Jenkins. I'm a longtime resident of Thurston County, where I raised my two boys, Ryan and Kyle Brinton. This is my son, Kyle. It's a beautiful soul. While in high school, my son Kyle and several of his friends tried the pharmaceutical drug Oxycontin, and it changed his brain. I believe he felt it was safe because it was a prescription and not a street drug. What he did not know was the chemical makeup of oxycodone, hydrocodone, morphine, and other synthetic opiates have the same chemical derivatives as heroin. I, along with thousands and thousands of other parents, lost my beautiful child to an opioid overdose. My son Kyle was 31 years old and fought the battle of addiction for 10 years. No one hated this disease more than himself. After 2.5 years of sobriety, on October 7th, 2017, Kyle relapsed, used heroin, and died instantly. His pregnant fiancée found him slumped over their kitchen table. Kyle showed no indication of a mental illness growing up. His mental illness was caused from an addiction to opiates. Kyle left behind his unborn son, Knox Kyle, who was born last April and who is now being raised without his daddy. My grandson is not alone in growing up without a parent. So many families are losing loved ones, which now is affecting an entire generation. Last year, I sat with Governor Inslee as he declared an opiate epidemic for Washington State, and sat with Thurston County commissioners as they declared this an epidemic also, But now what? How can we help this generation? When an addict reaches out for help, we have a 24-hour window to help them. Trying to find a bed for detox or for rehab is not always immediately available, or there's a waiting period for insurance to approve treatment. During this wait, most addicts are lost back into the darkness of the disease. When a parent loses a child, it's the worst pain you can imagine. Knowing that no matter what you do, you cannot save your child. I feel that my purpose for my son's death is to speak out, to take the shame out of this disease and change the stigma. And this is an ongoing battle. Parents continue to bury their children in secrecy because of the shame, and I don't want other parents to feel this pain as I do. I try to give them hope, but hope dwindles, and then I support parents going through this same grief. Right now, it feels like a death sentence until we can provide addicts the help and resources they need to adequately treat their illness. I made a promise to my son, Kyle, and to God that I will continue to speak up and share, and I will do whatever I can to bring awareness to this disease. Kyle's death has a purpose, and it is time to save this generation. Thank you for this opportunity to share my story with you today, and please do not give up hope. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So we appreciate all the speakers and folks who are here, especially Tammy and Shani, of course. challenging for anyone to get in front of a group of cameras and speak about anything, but especially, you know, for what they've gone through is especially challenging. So we really appreciate them putting a face on this epidemic. Before we take your questions, I'll just say I speak a lot about opioids around the state, Rotary clubs, et cetera, and it is rare when I talk about opioids and mention the statistics I've mentioned to a group of people where after the talk, almost always someone will come up to me after I've talked about it, and they'll say, "Hey, Bob, can I talk to you for a second?" And they kind of pull me aside. And I know exactly what they're going to talk about. I know every time. They're going to talk about this issue. And they're going to say is, my child, my colleague, my sister, my parent, myself, here's my experience, here's what happened. It crosses every social, economic demographic. It doesn't care how old you are, how young you are. You know, it doesn't care. It doesn't care. It cuts through all that. And, you know, the impacts are enormous. And you know, I'll just say is, you know, some things make me especially angry. The conduct of these companies falls in that category. You know, there aren't really words that capture it, right? But, you know, I think when we're here several months ago now about the litigation against Purdue Pharmaceutical, I think I said then, you know, how do the CEOs of these companies sleep at night? How do they? You know, how do they? So, you know, it's our job to hold these companies accountable. This will not be an easy task. Litigation like this is very, very challenging. These companies have all the resources one can want to defend themselves. But I'm very confident in our case. I'm very confident in our legal team. And one of the key goals is to what you were mentioning just a few moments ago is the need for more treatment, for more resources in communities where people in our state are grappling with this addiction so they can get the help that they need. And all of our jurisdictions and groups working on these issues are under-resourced. It is my hope that these lawsuits, combined with others, can bring accountability to these companies, and that it brings in additional resources to our state to help these current and future generations get the help that they need. So with that, we will take your questions, and I'll do my best for those who may be on the phone to repeat the question, and we'll do our best here too as speakers come up to identify ourselves so you know on the phone who we are. So who would like to go first? Yes. Oh, sorry. Go right ahead. Yeah.
Your job is to enforce current law, but is there any legislation you wish that had been passed, whether it's federal or state, that could help with this crisis?
Good question. So the question is there any legislation that could be passed to address this? And so, yes, actually, I think it was 2 years ago. I'm look for Mike Webb, my chief of staff. We'll make sure I get the right year. But I think it was 2 years ago that I first proposed legislation. Dan Snoding said 2 years ago to the state legislature on two different fronts with the opioid epidemic. So I asked my team this question: hey, what can we do in Washington State? What we discovered is other states, red states, blue states, purple states, all grappling with the same epidemic, had done two key things. One is having pill limits. So I think the example was mentioned earlier, I think by you, doctor, hey, if a young person goes in and gets their wisdom teeth pulled, do they really need a 30-day or 20-day supply of opioids? No, they do not. One of two things will happen. They'll take all 20 pills because, well, their doctor gave it to them. That's a bad start. Or they'll take a couple of them, put the rest on their shelf, and now their roommate can access them, or a friend who comes over, or someone who breaks into the apartment. So to put pill limits in place, many other states have that. We had no pill limits at all, as recently as several months ago. I proposed legislation to put pill limits in place. It was a bipartisan proposal. The legislature did not adopt that proposal, which was disappointing in the extreme. There has been a rulemaking process that has put some pill limits in place, which I think is a step in the right direction, but not as far as I'd hope we'd go. Number two, real quickly, we have what's called a prescription monitoring program, often called the PMP. So this is if I go in to see a doctor and I say, hey, I've got pain, doctor, I'm looking for some pills to address that. My doctor can go to this PMP database and see what my history is in getting opioids. So the doctor could see if I've been pill shopping or if I truly have pain for this one-time occurrence. Many states require the doctor, when I walk in, to check before turning over any pills. Washington State has not required that. The database is available. So we had a proposal to require that the first time, every time someone comes in, you check that database. Yes, it's a little bit inconvenient, I get that, but you do it. That was opposed by some folks in the industry. The legislature did not adopt it. It went through a rulemaking process. There was a rule change that does help on checking that not in the way that I wanted. It is a step in the right direction, but it's my hope we'll get every time, checking every time. So there are policy things we can do that other states are doing. I think there's still more we could do. So from our standpoint, it's sort of a couple fronts. One, the policy side, which has been seen an improvement, and number two, the litigation side as well. Yes?
The legislation that's currently in Olympia right now that was proposed by the governor would address that prescription monitoring program, correct?
And so there is legislation proposed by the governor, which is quite broad, that addresses many fronts. I'm not sure what the latest is in terms of amendments and all that, so afterwards Mike Webb, my chief of staff, is here. He'll know those details. We obviously support what's going on there as well. But just to be clear, as recently as a year or so ago, we had no pill limits. We did not have to check, you didn't have to check the prescription monitoring program. Many other states required both those things. So just speaking candidly, right, there's no other way to talk about it when you're, right, with folks who have suffered. Washington State has been behind on this. It's just a fact. You can't sugarcoat it. I think we're catching up, but we need to move more quickly.
Do you feel like because we're behind all of this, we've become an easy target for some of these distributors?
So the question is, because on our policy front we were behind other states, have we become an easy target? I don't know that I can answer that question. You know, others may want to weigh in. I'm not sure I can answer that question. What I can say is, if one has a crisis, if one has an epidemic, treat it like that. Treat it like that. And you know, I know when I testified in Olympia last year about this, I was asked a question like, well, hey, do we need to do this right away, or can we go through a rulemaking process? You know, I said, you know, I have 3 words for you: people are dying. And I don't like to speak so directly to the legislature, but you know,
People are dying.
people are dying, right? And so I just think it's important for people to hear that, right? And for people to meet parents who have lost loved ones because of the epidemic. It's a hard subject, God knows, right? It's a hard subject. But, you know, if you're having a crisis, if the families, you do everything you can, right? You just, all resources go to deal with what's going on. That's how life works. Well, it's no different than for a government or for a state. If you're dealing with an epidemic, treat like it's an epidemic. If you have a crisis, treat like a crisis. Make it the priority and address it. Yes?
I have a couple questions. First of all, are there other states that have sued distributors, or is Washington now the first?
So the question is, and my legal team can jump in if they want to add details. The question is, have other states sued distributors? The answer is yes. So other states have sued distributors. With the litigation, I guess what I'll just say generally is, I think it's fair to say that I just came back from a conference with the National Association of Attorneys General. The issue of opioids generally and opioid litigation specifically was a big topic of that meeting. So many states and local jurisdictions are engaged in litigation. When we sued Purdue Pharmaceutical, for example, the largest manufacturer, the creator of OxyContin, we weren't the very first state, but I think maybe we were the second state to sue. Others now have joined, and so now we're taking the next step, which is these distributors.
Do you have any idea how many states?
I'm going to turn to my, do you know how many states? Anyone, come on up. This is Jeff Rupert from my team, and feel free to add anything to that.
Yeah, Jeff Rupert here. I believe Washington will be the 10th state to sue at least one distributor.
Just say it right.
These same distributors have been sued by others? These same 3 have been sued by others, or not?
Some states have only chosen to sue 1 or 2 of these main 3 distributors. It's going to depend on each state about who the main distributors in that state are, and that's the variance. In addition to the states, there are many, many municipalities and tribes that have sued. And those cases are all in Cleveland, Ohio, or many of them are there. I believe there's over 1,700 cases that have been filed against various companies in the opioid, either manufacturer, distributor, or other levels of the crisis.
And
Yes.
Did any of those cases come to finalization either way, or are they all still pending?
They're all still pending.
And Snohomish County just about 6 weeks ago on its own, outside of the Ohio case, I believe, announced a lawsuit against distributors. Any collaboration or discussion?
We certainly talk with various attorneys that are out there as well as the counties, but I can't really elaborate more than that.
The longest case, how long has it been going? Do you know? I mean, 'cause that's one of the problems with these types of cases is they drag on for decades and no resolution really happens.
Sure. The first trials against certain manufacturers is set for in Oklahoma in May of this year. As far as these distributor companies, there are some Ohio cases, municipalities, I think it's 2 counties, that are set to go to trial in October of this year.
And so just to add, don't go too far, Jeff. So on that, Jeff lives this as do a number of folks on my team, as you can imagine. a couple thoughts. So one is, without getting in the details, but just an important general points, states have different legal claims we can make and seek different things than local jurisdictions. And so it is critically important that states and additional states join in this litigation. And so number two, I think it's fair to say that the opioid litigation generally is extremely complex for many reasons. The scope, the extent, the number of plaintiffs. That said, the Purdue pharmaceutical case, for example, Washington was part of a multi-state investigation of many states. I pulled Washington out of that multi-state to file that lawsuit. I felt it was time to, not a criticism of anyone else, but I felt it was time to move forward in the litigation front. So there is, I think it is important for Washington State to put significant resources into this litigation and drive towards a trial date to put as much maximum pressure on these distributors and Purdue as well. But it is a challenging, I want to be really clear, right? This is challenging litigation in the extreme for many reasons.
What kind of shipments, what kind of pills are we talking about that these shipments including? OxyContin, oxycodone, methadone? Can anyone answer?
Do you want, are you,
Yeah, Tad, do you want to come up here?
So this is Tad from my office who will address the question, which is what kinds of pills are we talking about that are coming into Washington State? Tad, do you mind?
This is Tad Robinson-Neal. I'm an assistant attorney general, and I've been working on these opioid cases for almost three years now. The pills that are flowing into Washington run the gamut. Oxycodone is one of them. That's one of the primary ones. Hydrocodone as well. Methadone is one. Buprenorphine. There's basically all of the pills. There's, I don't know, about 10 or 15 different brands that are shipped into the state.
That are specifically named in this shipment as part of this lawsuit?
Yeah, the distributors ship all. The only entities that can ship opioids into the state are distributors. They have to be licensed with the DEA and with the Washington State, and they're responsible for all of the opioids that are being shipped into the state.
So, do any of you, including maybe Gary Franklin, do you have a comment on the experience that Tammy talked about the methadone clinics and the problems of trying to detox off them and the problems of treatment? Can you address that?
Do you mind repeating the question for the folks? If you're not able, don't.
The question relates to is there any other information on a specific problem with methadone? We do know that methadone it's also used for pain. It has been for years used to treat addiction, usually in heroin addicts, but it also has been used to treat pain. And we know that the way methadone works in the body is it sticks around for a long time. And the way an opioid is going to kill you is you go to sleep and you stop breathing. And so if you haven't taken something for a few days and then you're sort of opioid naive for a few days and then you take something strong like that, you're going to go to sleep and stop breathing and you might die. So methadone itself is so complicated for pain that you have to know something special about it to even write that prescription. So methadone is a complicated drug for both the treatment of addiction and the treatment of pain, and it is used for both things. We have seen quite a few deaths just among methadone patients, but the thing is methadone from methadone clinics is not tracked in our pharmacy systems. It's not. We've been doing a lot of work looking at Medicaid deaths and looking at which opioids were prescribed prior to the Medicaid deaths, and you can't find the ones related to methadone given to the patient for, say, heroin addiction. So they're actually hard to track.
So is this a different kind of problem that Tammy was talking about? Not only is there this flood of pills that are coming into the state, but also we don't really know the best ways of treating addiction, and there's a problem with the way clinics are going about it?
Yeah, I mentioned there are three main strategic things that we have to do. The third one, and the hardest one, is to address all of the patients on chronic opioids, to assess them, to include their families in trying to figure out whether they're just dependent or addicted. 100% of people on chronic opioids are dependent. Even if it's just for a few weeks or a month, they're going to have trouble getting off of the opioids, even if it was just started after a surgery. So these are the things we have to pay attention to, and the public-private collaborative, the statutory Robert Bree Collaborative, is working specifically on dealing with the patients that are on chronic opioids. We have 6,000 just in the workers' compensation system. I'm sure there are more than 20,000 in the state that are on chronic opioids, and nobody's really addressing them. No one is systematically trying to help them, and that's what we would like to do.
And that has been, one of the major pushbacks, I think, both in Congress and here in our state legislature, when we've tried to pass opioid legislation, is that there's concern by those chronic patients who've been on opioids for years and don't feel like they can live or do their daily jobs without them. How do you deal with that?
Go ahead. First of all, we can't even tell if they're addicted or not. There's no good test or psychometric instrument that you can give to a patient on chronic opioids, and some people have called that this huge gray zone. So 90% of the people on chronic opioids, we don't know if they're just dependent and they'll have trouble stopping it, or if they're actually addicted. So this is part of what we're trying to deal with at the Bree Collaborative. And I have to say that on August the 9th, the state has funded a special conference that we're going to have, a state-of-the-art conference on addressing these patients that are on chronic opioids, to tell how would you address them, how would you assess them, what path do you go down? Do you go down a tapering path or a treatment of addiction path? And with whatever you do, you've got to get them good treatment for pain. And we're not paying for that very much either.
And just at that point, I should take a question or two on the line if folks have them. But with the opioid epidemic, it is a complicated, challenging issue to address on multiple fronts, as many of you know. A key point, though, and again, just to emphasize, I have certain tools. One of those is litigation. I plan on using the tools that I have to address this issue. And a key goal from this is, to what you've heard from many of the speakers now, is the need for additional dollars to address treatment in our communities for so many folks who are suffering from this addiction. We are woefully under-resourced in that department. And frankly, the entities that should pay for that are those that have caused the harm, that have caused the tragedy. That's defendants like these three distributors, that's defendants like Purdue Pharmaceuticals. So that is a key goal here, is any resolution for these cases must include significant dollars that I can turn back into communities to address all these challenges that we're facing, for sure. Let's see if anyone on the phone has, if you don't mind introducing yourself. I know it can be a little tricky on the phone, but if you have a question, anyone on the phone, we're happy to take it. If not, is there a final question here? We'll be, I think we're all available to answer questions also one-on-one, so we'll be around, but if there's maybe one last question here, or two, let's do two more and then we'll wrap up. Yeah, go right ahead.
I just want to follow up that question on pushback. There was a report that came out a few months ago that talked about people who are getting opioids for chronic pain who feel like they're not getting what they need because there's this wariness of doctors to prescribe, even in cases that they feel like it's called for. I wonder if you could address that.
I mean, sure. Look, is there a balance here? Of course, right? And we ran this. We proposed our policy on having pill limits, and the legislation we proposed carved out exceptions for folks who have ongoing chronic pain that they're in a different situation than a 17-year-old who's getting their wisdom teeth pulled out. So I think we can recognize there are individuals in different situations. That said, well, we have our distributors who are flooding our market with pills who are not following the rules. They see suspicious orders. They do not flag those. They do not stop shipment. They do not notify the DEA. That is wrong. That is illegal. That is resulting in people dying. Full stop. That's the focus here. So yes, there are many layers of this human tragedy that is complicated. No two people are in exactly the same situation. I think you can hear that from the two mothers we heard from today, right? Each story is different, but our focus here is on these distributors. One more question?
You had mentioned talking about these distributors and breaking the laws, not reporting suspicious orders. Can you go through the fines that they've received, and are they acting as a deterrent? Do you think the fines should go up? I mean, because it seems like it's just a drop in the bucket compared to their profits off of these opioids.
I agree with everything you said. Yes, it's a drop in the bucket. No, the fines are not sufficient. No, the fines have not deterred the conduct. Agree on all counts. So, you know, how to respond to that? It's look, these companies know what they're doing, and no, a fine of $100 million or whatever it is not. These are Fortune 15 companies, right? That does not mean that we should simply throw up our arms and say, well, hey, that's, you know, that didn't stop the conduct, or that's, you know, didn't get the job done. I think the opposite is how, I think we all feel the opposite of that, which is making sure there's accountability. And part of, which I should emphasize, is that, you know, there are many goals of our litigation, but one goal of the litigation is the people of our state deserve to know the volume of pills that fled into our market. The people of Ponderay County, and you'll see other counties on this chart afterwards, the people of those counties should know how many pills have gone into those counties. You know, it is, you know, it is outrageous, right? And so litigation can help daylight the conduct, and that can help inform a people, a legislature, on what's going on, what the extent of that is. So that is something that that is important to me and to the team as well. But no, I would agree with the premise of your question that the epidemic is still raging in our communities, and I'm under no illusions that this lawsuit, any more than any one lawsuit, will stop it. But I do believe there's a power in the jurisdictions that have come together to hold them accountable. I'm confident there will be accountability on these cases. I'm confident there will be significant resources for the state of Washington to pass on to local jurisdictions to address this. You know, just as a final thought, you know, nothing we can do is going to bring back the lives that have been lost, right? And these companies have to live with that, but they need to be held accountable for their conduct. And so, we will be pushing hard in this litigation, as we are with the Purdue Pharmaceutical litigation. And you know, I guess it's you know, as a final thought, it is difficult to give a sense of scale of this epidemic. It is. I've thought many ways of how to articulate it, but I so appreciate you know, the two of you, being here to speak, because it is the most important message. You know, more important than some guy in a tie, you know, who's a lawyer, right? It is. And so, you know, I often say sometimes I've learned a lot about opioids in the last couple of years, to put it very, very mildly. You know, one thing I sometimes say is, as a father of young children, you know, would I worry about many things any parent does, right, with their children, right? Getting them to school, etc., whatever it is, of course you worry. But if I had to pick two things I most worry about, it's mental health issues for them at some point and addiction issues. Because I've seen, I've just talked to too many family members who have grappled with those two issues. And so anyway, I've gone on too long. We're gonna do what we can. We're gonna get resources back into communities, and we're gonna hold these 3 distributors accountable for their conduct. Thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate it.